Hello there. This is a video I've been thinking about making for quite some time, and it's taken me a while to get round to it. So, um, people will be aware whether they're pagans or druids or nothing to do with this about the fact that there are druids today. Of course, these are not the same as the druids of old, and people should be well aware of that. They really should. There is no continuous line between the ancient druids and the modern druids, and anybody who's trying to convince you of that is either a fantasist or a liar, I'm afraid. So, um, the druids of a current age you could call neo-Druids, I guess is the most accurate term for them, because the beginnings of the modern Druid movement can be traced back to the early 1700s. So we're talking roughly 300 years. And of that, I'd say there's very, very few that are sort of hereditary Druids going back to that time period. It's not sort of a lineage that's been passed down over 300 years for most people. In fact, most people who are Druids today are those who converted in their own lifetime. There's very few whose parents or grandparents were Druids that have, become Druids. So it's kind of a bit of a trendy new age thing. And that's not to say there aren't people who are serious about it. I've tried to be very serious in my own part as a Druid. But I find myself facing this question over and over again. Do Druids have a role in modern society? Are we relevant? Do we do anything that's actually really relevant to modern life? And I'm going to go through this and I'll give you my conclusions at the end. But really we're going to look at what a Druid actually is supposed to do, and compare it maybe with other religions and other roles in modern society, and see where that ends up. So, for a start, I'd say if you compare the Druid of today with other priests or priesthood or whatever, there's quite a difference, really. People who are trained as, say, a rabbi or a Christian priest or a Buddhist monk or Buddhist priest or Hindu priest or a Muslim imam or whatever, they've all undergone considerable training and considerable amount of time to be recognized as an officiant or a practitioner or a priest, if you like. For the vast majority of these religions, that's restricted to men, but not always. You do have female Christian preachers and priests, and also female rabbis. Within paganism and Druidry in particular, or Druidism, you also have women. So, I consider that to be a good thing, that is open to everyone and not just to men, which still seems rather silly to me. I would say in general, these other religions I mentioned and these other paths command a much higher level of respect because of the process. I suppose it's rather more dogmatic, but you can't just rock up and say, hey, I'm a Catholic priest. You have to go to a seminary. You have to be accepted first to study, and then you study, and then you become a curate, and you get your first parish, and you're still basically on probation. And finally, you will be sort of accepted, and you're a full member of the priesthood. It's not like that in Druidism. There are some schools you can join. There is some training you can do, but a lot of it, you can just do this online. You can do this by correspondence. And you could just decide not to bother with any of that and just put on a cape and get yourself a big staff, a big drum, start wearing some plastic ivy on your head or whatever, or maybe real ivy if you can be bothered. And most of these people doing it, I've noticed, seem to be wearing plastic plants, not real ones. And just rock up somewhere and say, hey, I'm a druid. You show up at Stonehenge or Glastonbury or Tara, the Hill of Tara in Ireland, or Carnac in France or something, and just say, hey, I'm a druid. And you don't have to prove anything. You don't have to have done training. You can very easily pass yourself off as a druid without any proof whatsoever. That's not the case if you want to become a Hindu priest or a rabbi or, a Roman Catholic or Church of England priest, etc., 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 or an imam or whatever. So I think that's a fundamental problem with Druidism and Druidry, in that it's not very serious in that respect, in that you don't have to do anything. You can self-identify and just say, I'm a Druid, and people just kind of have to take your word for it. And that, I think, is a great weakness, and that is one of the reasons why it's not respected very much, because you get these nutters who show up and say, I'm so and so, I'm the king of this and that, and I'm the archdruid of blah de blah, and I'm the druid of the moon or something, or I'm a druid of the the Slough bypass, or some other crap, and just come up with absolutely ridiculous infantile nonsense that they're this big important I am, and self-appointed titles and all this bollocks. And I'm just like, no, you're just putting Druidism into the area of disrespect, and you're denigrating your own path. And the more kind of pathetic LARPing and stupid careening and poncing about and pretending that you're somebody important, it's just egotism as far as I'm concerned, and it just brings the whole thing into disrepute. And no wonder people don't take Druidism very seriously when you get people like that asking about, just claiming all kinds of nonsense with absolutely no proof whatsoever that they're legitimate in any way. On the other side, you've got people who've spent 3 to 20 years studying, some even longer. You could say it takes a lifetime. You're still studying. I've been studying this since 1995, and I'm still learning now. This is 31 years later, and I still have more to learn. So there is the serious end of it, but unfortunately the idiots who just careen around the place in their stupid clothes really just ruin it in terms of being taken seriously by the public and by people who might potentially be interested in this as an actual legitimate spiritual path. So I'm going to move on now to the actual roles. So if you look at the ancient roles, but primarily you've got really spiritual religious leadership, you've got political advisors, you've got the medicine practitioner, herbalist, that also cross over into shaman and sort of psychopomp, or someone that deals with death. And then you've got law and justice. You've got genealogy, which relates generally to the kings or lords that you worked for, because these people were employed, they worked for very wealthy, important people in their time, in the sort of monarchic age. And you've also got the creative arts as well. So you've got quite a lot of areas there to touch on. I would say that there's one extra area which is very much a modern invention, which is part of a Druidic path, which is sort of love of the environment and nature. I would say this was just a given back in the day. You didn't need an environmental movement. If you look at 2,000 years ago, there was hardly any people in the world compared to today. And, the vast tracts of land that have been destroyed and tarmacked and turned into cities, it wasn't like that. There were very few cities. There was a tiny population of humans. So it was a different situation. The environment wasn't under threat in the way it is now. There weren't huge companies like DuPont or Monsanto or Nestle or whatever messing the planet up. The companies didn't even exist. The idea of the corporation didn't even exist back then. Okay, you had organization, you had hierarchies, but you didn't have anything like what we've had, or an industrial revolution either. So, in terms of environmentalism, the modern Druid's role never existed in ancient times. So that's something that's very appealing maybe now to people who want to get involved in Druidism, but it wasn't relevant back in the day. So I want to be very clear about that. That's an important point, I think. But I'm going to go through my list here, and I'll start with the spirituality of religion. Obviously, there is a role there, but we don't really know that much about what original paganism was really, really like. We've got some idea, based on accounts, based on archaeology to a small extent, and also based on the translations of old texts in Welsh and Irish and Scottish languages. Well, the Scottish is more or less Irish, really, pretty much the same. So there is obviously a function there, and for people who do take it seriously, that want to be pagans, they want to be Druids, or sort of rather followers, lay people, you might want a Druid to officiate for you. It does seem rather ridiculous if everybody involved in paganism is an actual priest, or it's a bit like you went to mass and the whole place was full of cardinals and no lay people. It would seem rather silly. In certain terms, paganism can seem very like that. It's full of chiefs, who are like important Druids, and there's very few lay people, which is a really odd situation. You wouldn't go to mass and see the place full of bishops, and there'd be like three old ladies at the back who are lay people, and everyone else is a bishop or a cardinal or a monsignor or whatever. It's a very, very odd setup in that respect. You don't see that in other religious paths. The other thing is, at the time, that was pretty much the main thing in Western Europe. There weren't millions of choices about what religion you're going to follow. Well, nowadays there's about 5,000 religions left on the planet. So in theory, you've got a choice of about 5,000 that you could pick from. Although getting full knowledge about all of those is very, very difficult indeed. You could say realistically, you could probably find out about, I don't know, somewhere between 10 and 100 different religions without too much difficulty, and then go off and try and become one of those. But back in the sort of pre-Christian era, certainly in Western Europe, there weren't loads of options. It was basically the sort of tribal religion that you belonged to, that you were born into, and that's pretty much about it. There might be some overlaps with the Greek and Roman cultures, where so-called Celtic peoples had come into contact with them, so you do get some bit of an overlap there. But the geographical isolation and lack of things like trains, planes, and automobiles meant that these religions didn't travel far or very quickly. If you look at the spread of, say, Buddhism and early Christianity, it took considerable time. It took a long, long time to spread around. And so I think there is a sort of big difference in how people perceive Druids as religious practitioners and in comparison to other paths. So, that's a problem. And nowadays, if you look at political advice, no one employs a Druid as their political advisor. I don't know anyone anywhere who has done such a thing in any country that I can think of. Maybe there is somebody somewhere who's employed a Druid as an advisor, but I've yet to find out about that. I do know a few pagans have stood for office. As far as I can see, most of them have been miserable failures. There are one or two people who have managed to get elected, but generally not. So, pardon me, this role was a big thing back in the day, and the politics back in, say, 2,000 years ago was completely different from now. You didn't have political parties. You basically had tribal lords and kings. So you might have one king who's fallen out with another king, wants to make an alliance or go to war, and your Druid would sort of give you advice and try and be a negotiator. So it was somewhat different, you could say. In fact, the Druids were on occasion directly involved in war on a magical basis. So it's nothing like the politics of today. Most of these advisors are either part of the civil service or they've been privately appointed by, a president, by a prime minister, or by, a minister of whatever country it is. And I don't see them all rushing out to hire Druids as their advisors, to be honest with you. So, moving on the list a bit, medicine and herbalism. We've had actual professional medics for quite some time. They've been around for hundreds of years. You could argue that a lot of them in the medieval times were quacks, right through the Renaissance up into probably, the end of the 19th century, that it became a bit more serious and a bit more credible. And a lot of what they were doing up till sort of the 1800s was really based on medieval ideas, a lot of ancient Greek and Roman medicine, in fact. There isn't really much of a need for Druids in a medical capacity, really, is there today, to be honest. Most people were interested in allopathic medicine, and for those who are interested in alternative medicine, you've got all kinds of herbalism. You can, say, go to the Scottish School of Herbal Medicine and study there and become an official practitioner, and you don't have to become a Druid to do that, and you don't have to have any religious beliefs or spiritual knowledge, or you can be a total atheist and go and do that and learn all about herbalism. And so you get certified, but you don't have to be a Druid for that. So really, that's another really area where, does being a Druid actually make any difference? Perhaps not. So moving on, law and justice. We for a long time have had a legal system. The Romans had a complex legal system. Virtually every advanced culture did. Sort of Judaic culture, Greek culture, Persian culture, back all the way to the Sumerians. All kinds of cultures all over the world, in every continent, actually had legal systems of some kind and legal practitioners. So you had a sort of system in Western Europe. In Ireland, you had in particular Brehon laws, which were codified, and before they were written down, they would have been memorized by the Druids. But today we don't have a system. Most of the systems in Europe and the States are based primarily on English law and adaptations of that system. So you have your lawyers, you have barristers, solicitors, You have judges as well. And you also have juries in many cases who will actually make the decision about guilt or lack of guilt. So you've got this whole system. So people may be critical of the system, and some people might say, oh, Brehon law would be much better, but that's not going to happen just like that. It would take an overthrow of the entire legal systems and establishment of a new system for that to happen. And I'm not sure that most people would actually agree that we'd be better off with Brehon law. For a start, most people don't know anything much about Brehon law to be able to judge and make a comparison. They don't know how much about the current legal systems across the world. So, who would be qualified to judge is one system better than the other? You could argue there are benefits to both systems. You could argue that one system is much better than the other. I'd be inclined to think that maybe Brehon law is a bit fairer. It's more restorative rather than punitive. And it was certainly fairer to women in general, historically. But, you can't just say, right, that's it, law system's over and we're going to have Brehon law now. That kind of thing is completely impractical, and it's not going to happen. And you consider that most people really don't have much of an interest in Druidic culture or an archaic system from Ireland and having that implemented either in modern Ireland or anywhere else. So I think that one's out the window as well, pretty much, to be honest. Another area would be sort of the role of a shaman and a psychopomp. And that touches into modern psychology really today. So the psychologist and psychotherapist would take on much of this kind of area. And of course you have the priest who deals with death, with the dying and their last rites and funerals for people. And in some cultures there would be sort of a passing over into the afterlife. In others, it's not really attended to. So, depending on what culture, there may be overlaps. But these are, generally taken on either through psychology, these areas are addressed, or psychotherapy, or by actual priesthood. Like, for instance, when someone has died and people are grieving, the modern thing to do probably is go and see a counsellor, psychotherapist or something, and talk about it, or talk about it with your family perhaps. And if you've got no one, you probably go to a psychotherapist to talk about these things. So if you're in other religions, you might go and see a priest. Say if you're a Catholic, you might go and see the priest and say you're having trouble dealing with somebody's death and you're grieving, and they might try to advise you and help you, and they might pray with you or encourage you to say certain prayers, etc. So from my experience, there's not been a lot of call for that with Druids, really. There has been a call for Druid funerals, and I have officiated them, but generally in my experience, people contacting you for help and advice with regard to grieving is quite a rarity. It doesn't happen very much. I think that's more likely to be the remit of the mainstream religions, to be honest, that kind of thing would happen. So another area of the old Druids would be genealogy, and this generally applies to the clan and family history of who they work for. So if you worked for a king, say you were a Druid of Cormac MacCart, you would learn his entire lineage going back as far as could be remembered, and you would learn great poems about Cormac's ancestors and sing their praises, and you would write poems probably about Cormac and sing his praises and remember his achievements, the great battles he won, or moments of great wisdom that he had presided over. So that's been supplanted pretty much now by photography, by Ancestry.com, get your DNA test on, using records as well. So you can go through the census and birth and death records and find out all the stuff about your family going back hundreds of years, which is a role that was performed by Druids. But unfortunately for ordinary people, this was only applied to the super rich monarchic or aristocratic types, and not to the hoi polloi. The regular peasant was going to be remembered by a druid. Of course not. A Lord Muck or whatever is paying him in gold coins or whatever, or a lively house to live in with infinite amounts of beef and vegetables, and whatever, a few servants. They're going to spend all their time and energy on remembering Lord Muck's family and writing eulogies and hymns of praise and poetry for that lineage, and not for some poor turnip farmer down the road who's got no money. I sound a bit cynical, but this is the reality of how it worked. You did have some druids, minor druids, who officiated for ordinary people, it would seem, but to a large degree they dealt with aristocracy and royals, not with ordinary people. So, in terms of like the common person today, they wouldn't get a look in, and very few modern druids would actually be involved in this area of the history of particular families. Another big area is, of course, the creative arts. I already touched on this with poetry, the idea of poetry. Poetry back in the day wasn't so much about personal creativity or individual expression. It was more about, as I mentioned, genealogy, great events, huge battles, huge wars that raged, great famines, plagues, or whatever, would be captured in verse. And they also used the satires, and to, basically humiliate and curse people who were either, a bad ruler or someone who was offensive to the ruler, or a combatant or enemy who they wanted to disparage. So that's the way a lot of creative art was used then. Other things like song would have been relevant, not so much things like painting or sculpture, although you would have had maybe a limited amount of sculpture, and certainly the use of carving in the form of jewellery and such like, and stone objects. So you had stone masonry, you had maybe some wood carving, and you also had jewellers who were very creative within sort of so-called Celtic realms and amongst the sort of area of I suppose Druids themselves, I think, generally were confined to song, playing of music such as the harp and other instruments, and writing of poetry, which was the basic sort of form of how great events were recorded. Was not to write prose like a short story or not a book, or a biography of someone. You would write a poem, you'd write an epic poem about somebody's life, which would be comparable to what Homer did, the Odyssey about Odysseus, would be similar in concept to what the Druids would have done, celebrating the life of Cuchulainn or Cormac MacArt, as I mentioned earlier, or other equivalent people, Nile of the Nine Hostages, etc., etc. There's hundreds of examples you could cite. So, pretty much all of these examples that I've mentioned, they don't really translate very well into the modern world. Maybe the whole spirituality, religious thing, perhaps, but the rest of them, they're pretty much redundant. Even the eco-warrior, aspect of Druidism. You don't have to be a Druid to be an eco-warrior, to be a nature lover. You could be a horticulturist, a farmer, just a concerned citizen, a member of Greenpeace, a guerrilla gardener, whatever. You don't have to be involved in Druidism to care about the environment or be involved. So when I look at this list and I think about, are any of these essential is a Druid essential in any of these roles? And I have to say no, not really. You know. So I mean, Druidism is relevant to people who are interested in Druidry. Druidism is relevant to people who are interested in neo-paganism. But is it really relevant to everybody else? I wonder, to the rest of the world. And I have to say, on balance, no, it's not. It's not relevant. All these roles can be fulfilled by other people, and in some cases they might all be separated out into, say, like 7, 8, 9, 10 different people, or some of these people might cover several of those different aspects I've discussed. And I suppose they wouldn't be all combined together in this way, but then very few Druids actually specialised in all of these things that I mentioned. Hardly anybody really. People would pick 1, 2 or 3 specialist areas that they would work on for decades perhaps, and become an expert, like an expert in Brehon lore, or an expert in the creative arts and poetry, or possibly an expert political advisor to a king, etc. And you study negotiation and rhetoric, etc. In depth. So hardly any of the ancient Druids would have had all these great skills. There is one character called Lu, who is one of the Tuatha, who both became a High King but was also a Druid. He had all these amazing skills, but he is like really the one example I can think of somebody who could do pretty much everything and be brilliant at all of it. But in general, these roles are, tend to be separated out amongst the ancient Druids in the same way as they would be today. So you had this whole class of people who had specialist skills and specialist knowledge, and they had a special role in society. But they've pretty much all been supplanted by other types of people, some of them secular, some of them religious. So really, I would say being a Druid is just a matter of choice, really. It's a matter of personal preference. It doesn't really have a whole lot of relevance in terms of wider society. There is no need for Druids. All these roles can be covered by other people. And it might seem a bit of a mean thing to say, and it might seem a bit odd coming from someone who actually is a Druid, but I think the reality of it is there is no real exclusive role for Druids in modern society, because modern society doesn't care about Druids. The bulk of people actually just think of Druids as just weirdos and freaks and some kind of like odd cult-like sort of spiritual sort of subset, rather than somebody to be taken seriously. And given what I said about people who like to prance around and wear silly clothes and say ye a lot, and they don't help our cause in terms of being taken seriously. So I don't think that's likely to change a whole lot. Although neo-paganism has become increasingly popular, I very much doubt the actual role of an actual Druid is going to become front and centre in the mainstream of life. It will continue to be important and interesting to people who have an interest in neo-paganism and who have an interest in Druidism, and maybe people who have a particular interest in ancient history, particularly the Gaels in Ireland, and the Gauls in France, and the Britons in Britain, and perhaps parts, Brittany as well, and to some extent the people of northern Portugal and northern Spain too, where there probably were Druids. And you could argue that there were probably maybe Druids as far to the east as the Danube region. So, and there's some overlaps, I suppose, and interest with people who are interested in Slavic paganism and Norse paganism in Scandinavia. So, but these aren't very mainstream. These are all things that are sort of minority interests, minorities of religions. And so, I just really don't see how they could ever sort of become particularly relevant to mainstream society. So much as it sounds a bit disappointing, if you're watching this and you're really into Druidism, do they have a real role in modern society? No, Druids don't have a real role. They don't have a modern role. It's all been done by everybody else. So, it's a subset. It's a subset for people who have an interest in this kind of thing, and that's what it is. I have a big interest in Druidism and the history of it and the study of it and the philosophy and ethics of it too. But I realise it's very limited in scope, that most ordinary people just think it's weird and odd and perhaps maybe a bit sort of idiosyncratic and sort of something that your odd uncle might be into, sort of like the guy who built the massive cathedral in Barcelona, or Barcelona I should call it. That it's just a bit of a weird thing to do, very eccentric, oddity sort of. So I think that's how most people see Druidism, as very eccentric and odd and not really relevant. And I can't see that changing. So I think Druidism is interesting. I'm glad to have been part of this whole thing, but I am aware that it isn't mainstream, and it probably never will be, and it will probably never be relevant to the average person in the street. And I'm okay with accepting that. And I think it's something that I really felt I should make known, and I should share with the world, because I think not all people involved in this are realistic about where it falls in society. But I'm doing my best to be impartial and actually see reality as it is rather than what I'd like it to be. I'm not saying I'm always able to do that, but I do my best to look at things impartially. And I think in all truth, much as I am part of this movement, I don't believe that it is mainstream or that it ever will be. So that's pretty much it. That's all I've got to say. And I hope you found it interesting. And if you've got something to say about my opinion, I'd love to hear from you. Please leave a comment. And if you like the video, please give it a like. And if you want to see more of my content, please subscribe as well. It's all very helpful in terms of reaching out to people, because the YouTube algorithm's a bit tricky, and the more help you can get, the better it is for anybody that's running a small channel like this. Okay, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and bye for now.